It's more of a modular approach to level design. Yeah, it can get really confusing because it's a little different from the way, say, Max does instancing. If we jump into Max and I choose an object here, if I go to copy this object, which is basically the same as copy paste in Unreal or duplicate, so I'm just holding down the shift key to copy it though, Max gives me the option of a copy, an instance, or a reference. Now if I choose instance here, it's doing the same thing that Unreal is doing, but it's doing it more like a hardware instance, whereby if I change this mesh, it's going to change this mesh. So if I, any alterations I make to this one now will be changed on this one. It doesn't work that way in Unreal, so it's less like Max in that regard, less like a proper instance like in that regard. But you still do save on your polygon memory and texture memory by copying and reusing assets as much as possible. If you do want it to work like it does in Max, then you create a proper hardware instance through the blueprint using an instance static mesh and an array. But again, like I said, there's limitations to doing it this way. It's good for things like this curtain where the tassels are always going to be right next to each other. I'm not going to have tassels way back here and tassels in the foreground, so it'll work for this asset. But you can run into problems with lotting if the assets are in the background and in the foreground in the one blueprint. But you are going to save your draw calls, you are going to, do all the good stuff that an instance does. Sniper Echo says, I think you can select all the objects and press Ctrl G. Is this to merge them you're talking about, Sniper Echo? I'm just curious as to what the control... I haven't... Like I said, I don't use the merge command in Unreal, or I haven't for this level anyway. And they added it so that you reduce the amount of draw calls if you're reusing assets a lot. I would have thought that Control G would be more like a group, although, like I said, I haven't used it, so I'm not sure. Yeah, to merge them. Yeah, okay, yeah, okay, then yeah, that's true. And Unreal added that so that I think they've done it for things like a good example of that would maybe be rocks, like these rocks here. If I had 500 of these rocks scattered around my landscape, that's going to be at least 500 draw calls. It's actually more because it's a draw call for the mesh and a draw call then for the texture, and depending on how many textures you have on that asset, you can really start to add up on your draw calls. In which case, selecting all of those 500 rocks and merging them into one object would be a good way to go, because you're going to reduce your draw calls quite a lot. So yeah, that's the best example I can sort of think of in my level here, when you'd probably use the merge command. If you had 500 rocks scattered around your landscape here, that's more than 500 draw calls, which is really going to start slowing the engine down. Then you select all the rocks, you merge them, which reduces your draw calls a lot. So instead of 500 or possibly 550 draw calls, you're only going to have maybe 2 or 3. And it's the draw calls that will slow the engine down if there's too many of them. But do bear in mind that with DirectX 12, that's a big advantage now with DirectX 12 games. They've increased dramatically the number of draw calls you can use. Now, I don't know numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like a 10 times increase at least. So it's less of a problem with DirectX 12 games than it ever was with DirectX 11 or DirectX 10 or DirectX 9. So even the draw call issue now is going away. You're still going to be mindful of everything. You're still going to be mindful of polygon counts and texture memory and all that stuff, no matter any time you're making a game. But the draw call problem is less of a problem now with DirectX 12 because they've dramatically increased the ability to have tens of thousands of draw calls, which is one of the demos when Microsoft first released DirectX 12. They had that demo of, I don't know, they were like cubes that were popping in the background and above and below the horizon. Then they were all instances of one object and draw calls. And they showed an example of how many more draw calls you could use with DirectX 12 through this grid of cubes that were 3D cubes that you were flying through. So yeah, draw calls is another thing that they've been working on, and that is improved quite a lot with DirectX 12. Now, I don't know if Epic Games have actually updated the engine for DirectX 12 yet. I think you can do it experimentally. You have to use a command on the when you launch the program to put it into DirectX 12 mode. It's still in DirectX 11 by default at the moment. Yeah, they did. And Sniper Echo says, yeah, he thinks they removed the bottleneck in DirectX 12. They did. Well, not completely. You still can't go nuts with draw calls, but they've increased it hugely. So it's much less of a problem now with DirectX 12. But I don't think by default that Epic Games Unreal Engine uses DirectX 12. You've got to actually physically turn it on. So I think at the moment they're still using DirectX 11 or DirectX 10, depending on your video card. And unless you enable the feature for DirectX 12. But when they fully go DirectX 12 by default, which I assume they're going to do at some stage soon, Epic that is, it's really going to create, be less of a problem with draw calls on your assets. I know I read somewhere that the PS3 and the Xbox 360 had a limit of something like 500 draw calls, which is really low. Don't quote me, like I'm remembering an article I read about a year ago, whereas DirectX 12 games use tens of thousands of draw calls and it's not a problem. And that's with the PS4 and the Xbox Scorpio or S or whatever they're calling it now, Microsoft, their third generation Xbox One. Pardon me. So yeah, I know it can get confusing. This is one of the reasons I left games development, simply because the state of change in games is so great, because they constantly changing, adding different things, doing it different ways. That's just games development. It's an ever-evolving industry, and it happens at lightning pace. So it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. Yeah, you really got to be on top of everything going on in games development. So, and again, with DirectX 12 though, it's going to become less of a problem with draw calls. And that's really the only major issue at the moment, which is why Epic Games have introduced the ability to create these more hardware instances by using an array in your blueprint to reduce your draw calls. And so it's, even when DirectX 12 is fully implemented into Unreal, it's probably still a good way to do it like this, because you're still going to be saving. Anytime you can save some performance for a game or whatever you're doing is a good thing. In ArchViz, which I do, it's less of a problem for me because I don't have to worry about polygon counts or texture memory, because I'm doing rendering, and that's less of an issue for me. It can still be an issue if you don't have fast enough hardware, but and then you can use things like in Max, you saw when I did that copy, it was copy instance reference. If I go reference, then basically what Max will do is not load the asset in, just put a null pointer to it. So every time I do a render, it only loads it in when it does the render. That's to save memory. Sniper Echo says, I think the option for accessing DirectX 12 is easier to enable in 4.17 on release. Oh, okay. Well, that'll be good to know. I hope they release 4.17 soon. I know that they're doing their beta tests at the moment. And you can download it and use it now, but it's still it's not production ready, I don't think. So they don't recommend, if you're doing a project in Unreal, to use 4.17 until they officially release it. But it'll be good when they actually do start fully going into DirectX 12, because that'll save, that'll increase performance dramatically on everyone. For everyone that has a video card that can do DirectX 12, which is most people, because DirectX 12 is compatible with a lot of older hardware. So there are different tiers in DirectX 12 as to the features that you can get depending on the hardware, the graphics card you're using. So I know with my my old GTX 770, it's DirectX 12 compatible, just not up to the same level as the 1080, because the 1080 is a newer video card, so it can use more of the more advanced features of DirectX 12. But it'll certainly benefit everyone when they go fully DirectX 12 in Unreal. simply because, if nothing else, because of the draw call problem, because you won't have that issue with draw calls so much. Yeah, so like I said, with 3D games, it changes all the time, and there's so much. There are so many things to consider when you're doing a 3D game for performance. A lot more than you have to consider if you're just doing 3D rendering. But hey, it's real time, so obviously it's going to be more complicated to make, and more things to think about, because it's a real time game engine. It's not a static still image that's rendered out. Anyway, but I'll be glad when they release 4.17. I'll update to 4.17 once it's officially released. That's the reason I'm not bringing in any of the cloth physics at the moment, because I know that they've changed cloth physics in the new version of the engine. It's in Unreal 4.16.2, but you have to enable it as an experimental feature to use the new cloth physics. And I don't want to do that. I prefer to use whatever they have default in the engine. So I'm going to leave the flags and anything with cloth physics in the level until the very end, before we start doing the cinematic, to give Epic enough time to actually officially incorporate it into the engine. So that's my thinking for cloth. We're going to be using cloth. We've got banners and things that hang from the wall that will flutter in the wind, and rugs and things that are going to be using cloth physics that hang on the wall. But I'm not going to bring those in until the very last minute, just in case they change things. But the normal physics assets, like we're using for the hanging lights here, I'm bringing those in now, because to my knowledge they're not changing any of that. The actual physics objects are still going to stay the same. And yeah, just having a few physics objects just helps to add a bit of movement in our inside of our building. Alright, let's now again, I haven't done a rebuild on the lighting here, so these panels aren't going to blend too well until I do, and I generally don't do that until after the stream, because I don't want it's very boring for you guys to sit here and watch Unreal build lighting. It takes about a half an hour on my machine. But I've created a blueprint here and reused the assets from downstairs, so let's duplicate this blueprint and start filling in the rest of our windows. Just want to undo that move. This is why I really love using blueprints, because it allows me to easily and quickly move around an asset that's made up of a lot of different pieces. Well, not a lot. It's made up of 1, 2, 4 pieces, but it just allows me to move it around a lot more easily without using separate pieces at one at a time. It's duplicated again. Now you don't have to do a duplicate. Like I said, I can do a copy and a paste. It's exactly the same thing. Even if dragging it out, it's still going to you're still going to benefit from only using the poly memory once and texture memory once. But it's not a true hardware asset in that if I change anything on one, it's not going to change on all of them. But for things like this, it's not really going to benefit from a hardware instance like in a blueprint, because there aren't that many objects. It's only 4. So it's not adding hugely to the draw call. It's adding at least 4 draw calls, 4 objects, but that's not going to add up too much. Push that back. Okay, I'm going to scale this one out a little bit because this window is a little bit bigger. Alright. I'm going to double click the asset and do this scale on these individually because it can be thrown out a little bit depending on the asset, and in this case this is a different scale to the others, so same with the one at the bottom. Looks like this one needs to come up higher as well. I think this window down here is probably a big one like this as well, so I'm going to duplicate this one. I'm going to have to go through at some stage and fix the glass on that window too. I won't do that just yet. Alright, let's pull in a piece of plaster for above the windows here. I have a piece created. So I have my long pieces of plaster and then I've got more of a square one. It's just plain plaster without any decoration on it. Alright, I'm going to start by making sure the width is filled in correctly. Make sure it's back far enough. I'll scale it down a bit. I don't want to scale down too much because I don't want to start squishing my texture. We should be okay to get it. Just so long as it fits inside of our frame, it should be fine. And again, our colour will blend in once I do a rebuild on the lighting. I'll duplicate that again. Now for these ones above the window here, they're really narrow and really small. I don't want to have to go into Max and create one that's like this little piece of plaster. That's a waste of time, really. I have a couple of options here. I can either extend the plinth, this top wooden piece here above the window, higher, or we can use this piece of plaster here and manipulate it. Now, I don't really want to extend the wooden piece higher because we could, but I think a better way to do it will be to use the plaster and just manipulate this. So I'm going to duplicate it again. Let's rotate it 90 degrees. We'll make sure we scale it out so it fits that wall. And now I can't scale it down into that narrow piece because it's going to squash the texture too much. So it's actually not too bad, but I shouldn't really do that. But what I can do is scale it down so my texture doesn't squish too much and hide the rest of it inside either the wooden frame and partially into the ceiling, as we've done here with our columns. Because it's hidden up here in the ceiling, no one's ever going to see it. There is no gameplay or no camera that's going to come up into my roof cavity here. And even if there was, we can place a floor above it to hide it anyway. It's a similar thing that we did downstairs for the, where are we? These wooden pieces here. Half of it's actually hidden in the wall. You can see here. So we can get around the problem that way by hiding partially hiding it in the ceiling. Let's just duplicate that for the other side. Alright, and again we'll worry about the this little bay window a little bit later. We've got our wooden pieces around our windows. The floor is in. I may bring this floor back as far as the polish goes, but I don't want to do that until we get a bit more going on in the level. It's looking a little polished at the moment, even though this texture is, it's hard for me to see with the fog going on in the level, but you guys that saw last week, I actually have dirtied up this floor so it looks more weathered and worn. It's more worn through the middle than the edges. Actually, I'm just going to jump quickly back into Substance Painter here and show you what I mean. Again, this is just to, if you see here, the wearing that I've got going on the floor, just to sell the believability of the actual model, so it doesn't look clean and new. It looks like it's been weathered and worn, and there's more wearing going on in the middle of the floor than on the edge. There are still other floor sections we have to create, like out here, which will go well, so I'll go through that again. But I think what we can do here is we can start bringing in the curtains. So I'm going to select our curtains here that we've made. and our tassels. Let's duplicate it again. I could create a blueprint here, but size may be a bit off, so I'm just going to duplicate it first. Let's pull that upstairs. Alright, looks like this curtain needs to be a little bit bigger as far as the height goes than the one downstairs, so I'm going to start by pulling the top piece here in line. Let's scale you in. Copy, oh you're right, it is copy time, Sniper Echo. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes, guys. I'm going to grab a fresh cup of coffee, and I'll only be 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll be back and we can finish working on our curtains here. So I will be right back in just a few minutes, guys. Okay. I'm sure I don't have my mic muted there. Wouldn't be the first time. Let's finish working on this curtain. Again, I can scale this up in one direction so long as I don't have to scale it too much. I think we should just be okay. Just got to move my tassels down if I can find them here. There we go. Alright, now let's create a blueprint. Again, I'm not sure if the distance between these panels is exactly the same. It looks like this one may be a bit smaller. I don't really want to create a blueprint if I have to make too many adjustments, so I'm just going to copy them across again. It looks like it might be the same. I might be, but it looks like I have to move the curtains just a little bit. So I'm going to start by making sure my curtain cover up here is about the middle, and then we'll adjust the curtain position. I think I may just push the shear in the background back a little bit so it doesn't intersect my curtain up here. There we go. Right, now this one against these walls on the end. What I'm doing here is I'm going to use this curtain fabric for all the curtains along the outside edges, and I'm going to use this more decorative fabric here for the curtains more toward the inside of the building. So let's duplicate our curtain again. And while I have it selected, I'm going to duplicate it for the other end. And this one has to come in just a little bit. All right. Pardon me. Okay, so we've got our curtains in, our plaster's done. I think what we can bring in now are a couple of those hanging lights. I think we've got a wall light here. I think a hanging light on either end to match what we've got going on down here is probably a good idea. So let's do that. So I have my hanging light, the light and the thruster. Just going to duplicate it. Now with physics objects, you've got to be really careful if they start to look a bit weird when you turn physics on. It's generally a problem with the collision that you've got going on the asset it's attached to. Let's just move that over, move it up. The ceilings on the upper level are higher than the ones down on the ground level. So what we may end up doing is scaling up the light fitting. We'll see how we go. I just want to make sure it's in the middle of my roof. I'm just going to pull back and check the size. It's probably okay. I may scale it up a little bit later on, but we'll duplicate it one more time for the other end. Again, I want to make sure it's in the middle of my ceiling. I'm going to check it out from this angle. Alright, now let's turn physics on or simulation on to make sure that everything behaves the way it's supposed to be. Okay, now we have that problem. And I think that problem is because of the... I don't think I brought up the this thing here.